Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is the Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. I'll be speaking with Cheri about her most recent book, The Queer Evangelist. It's a memoir of her remarkable life, and it's published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of this series. The book's subtitle is A Socialist Clergy's Radically Honest Tale. Radical honesty is a recurring theme throughout the book. It's there Cheri discusses her upbringing, her life on the street, her sexuality, and it's also there she writes about her evolution from her activism and community organizing to running her own business and becoming a minister of the United Church of Canada, where in 2001 she performed the first legal same-sex marriage ever registered. And she didn't stop there. In 2006, she successfully ran as the new Democratic member representing Parkdale High Park and was elected to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. While in politics, she passed more LGBTQ bills than anyone in Canadian history before retiring in 2017 to become Minister of Trinity St. Paul's United Church and Centre for Faith, Justice and the Arts in Toronto. In her radically honest self-portrayal is a message of hope for those who yearn for change, but especially those who need reassurance that systemic reform is indeed within reach and worth pursuing. In this third episode of our four-part series, we talk about Cheri's experience while in political office, how she navigated the system, and why the revolution or nothing mentality is nonsense. One of the lessons you learned in politics is political parties will often fail to follow through on promises or break them outright, as we all know. All politicians, regardless of party, often use the same questionable tactics as their opponents across the aisle. You noted your own party, quote, wasn't somehow principled and ethical where others were not. All politicians learn this, but will admit it only if they're honest, end quote. You reconcile this paradox with a theological approach, you noted in your book, and basically you're acknowledging shortfalls, but continuing to push for change. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, my favorite political quote was one by a conservative at that time, Winston Churchill, who, when he was in government as prime minister in the UK, walked across the aisle and was talking to somebody. When he came back, one of his cabinet members turned to him and said, "Why are you speaking to them, Mr. Prime Minister? They're the enemy." And he said, "No, no, no." He said, "They're the opposition. The enemy sits behind me." And this is the first lesson that I think anybody who's mature in politics learns. And it takes a while because you go in and you're used to fighting the partisan battle and you get elected and they're the enemy and you're the good guys and there are no good guys in the enemy's ranks and there are no enemies in the good guys' rank. You come in thinking that way and you very, very, very quickly learn that that's not the way it works. Mm-hmm. And that truly, first of all, I mean, I really defend this, even though, it's hard to do these days, but if you're in it for the money, you're not in politics because you can make more money doing something else, right? And if you're lazy, you're not in politics, no matter what your political stripe, because it's an all-encompassing job. So I prefer to think, and I guess this is the Christian in me too, or at least the faithful person in me, that there is some good reason people sit in those seats. There is some motivating factor that they actually want to change the world for the better. Okay, so we can work with that. We may disagree ideologically on everything. We may disagree about how to make the world better. But, if we can start with that conversation and kind of proceed from there, we can get something done and we can start small. Mm-hmm. We can start motherhood and apple pie kinds of issues, but we can move on from there. The first tri-party bill that I passed was to declare the Holodomor, which was a Stalinist genocide in Ukraine, starving millions of people to death in the 30s, that all parties signed on to. We had large Ukrainian communities that wanted to see that happen, and that passed. And so that was, pretty motherhood. And we did some others like, Italian Jewish Heritage Month, Italian Heritage Day, and think kind of motherhood issues like that, where it's hard to disagree. We would get all parties together on that. And we moved from there to the controversial bills like trans rights, gender identity, and gender expression. All I needed was one conservative to sign on to that bill. So these kinds of movements happen by, again, working across the aisle and trying to bring people along in some way, shape, or form. Again, never alone, always with great activists behind you, and recognizing that, and I constantly reminded my own party of this, that nobody wants a one-party state. We really don't.
Right,
Every
right.
political party acts as if you do. They
Mm-hmm.
act as if you just want a one-party state. No, you do want differences of opinion. You do want ideological differences. We're going to have to learn to work with that. How do we do that? How do we make them less violent, to use a phrase? And how do we keep the conversation going? Now, our political systems don't help. And I just have to say that, not only as a socialist, but I mean, where you have situations where we're not forced to negotiate or compromise, it's obviously much, much more difficult. And so if we have proportional representation, which neither the United States or Canada has, we're
Yeah.
rare in democracies that we don't have that. So you don't have these minority parties in government or coalition governments very often. So we've lost the skills of negotiating. But even in majority governments, which I worked with for most of my political career, you can still get something done.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important to let politicians know. And effective politicians do get things done, because at the end of the day, the only people who fire you are your electorate, and they will look at what you got done. They don't want partisan hacks. They want people who actually responded to them and actually made changes that affect their lives and sometimes save lives. And that's what they recognize, and that's what they'll vote for.
Right. Excellent. Um, in your book that you had this practice of maintaining your own archives of printed press clippings and other sources. And as you say, quote, in politics, history is constantly being rewritten, unquote. Can you explain how politics rewrites history and in that sense, why it was important for you to maintain that archive?
Well, certainly we as women would know this by looking at history. Where are the women in history?
Yeah.
Well, they were there, but they didn't. They will appear in the front piece of a book. I'd like to thank my wife and my secretary and my editor and all of that. But yeah, so we know this. We know this as feminists. And it's not any less true in political life. I told you the story about the $10 minimum wage bill, and what was thought of that. But I mean, in other ways too, you know, legalized same-sex marriage. I mean, thank goodness that I had documentation for that. There was
Yeah.
press, and digital press disappears, right? Hard copy
Mm.
press does not. Try to research. It's difficult to research articles or that happened years back, if that are digital. But it's easy. It was easier, I found, in those days. It's getting easier now to do that. But when I was first elected, it wasn't that easy. And once it's off the paper, it was gone. So I did keep my own archives. I did quote them, and I still look at them and still use them to back up certain salient historical moments, like who did the first legalized same-sex marriage, things like that. But it's also true for other, even banning conversion therapy. I'm constantly reminding people in this country, because we're looking at a federal bill now, that we have banned it. And this is important because it protects lives.
Mm.
Children need to know this. They need to know that if their parent sends them to a therapist who's trying to turn them from queer to straight, that's illegal. They need to know
Yeah.
that, and they need it to be taught in their schools. They need to know that this law is a law. And again, unless you can back that up, then it's difficult. So I use my clippings a fair bit. I still have them, and it's important because I find that women tend to fall off the pages more, and men tend to replace them. I mean, certainly in the queer movement for queer rights, I mean, we see this time and time again. I mean, when we're looking at Stonewall, which is an anniversary is just happened. Who led that? Well, it wasn't white gay men. It was, in many cases, it was Black trans women, right?
Mm.
So how do we keep, not just for women, but for, racialized minorities, how do we keep that history alive? Indigenous history. How do we keep this history alive? It's not in our history books that most of us grew up with. How do we allow that to actually happen for the next generation so that they know about it? And that is, we have to make our own history. We have to keep our own history, and I think that's happening more now. But it certainly has been a struggle, and I'm very aware of that as a woman in politics. It's still going on.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So you've talked about this push and pull between reform and revolution, and I'm curious how you would describe that dynamic. Can you be part of a revolution and also expect reform? A great example is how elected officials take on their own parties, which is what you did, and we're still able to get a lot of legislation passed. Talk about the revolution or nothing mentality and why you think that's nonsense. What would you say to someone who embraces that kind of thinking?
Well, when push comes to shove, I think about simply saving lives. I think
Yeah,
about something very basic like that. I think about, the high rate of death among, for example, trans folk, and particularly trans folk of color, which is why the last bill I passed was a moment of silence that the legislature, still run by conservatives now, still has to stand for once a year.
hmm,
So laws change lives and they save lives. So when trans rights became rights, you couldn't fire someone for being trans. You couldn't not rent to someone. They could take you to a human rights tribunal if you were egregious. And again, still high rates of suicide and high rates of murder, no doubt. But I mean, higher rates without those kinds of pieces of legislation, higher rates of death among queer folk without legalized same sex marriage, higher rates of suicide among queer youth without gay straight alliances in schools, another uh, you know, bill that I worked on, without parent equality for same-sex couples who want to have their own children and don't want to have to adopt their own children. So all of
right,
these pieces of legislation make people's lives safer, and particularly make marginalized lives safer. And we can see this in terms of racism. We can see this in terms of indigenous rights. So it's not just for LGBTQ 2+ folk, which I've been most active around, but it really is for all those who are marginalized. These laws save lives. They do make a difference? Do they make the difference that we ultimately need? No.
mm,
So that's the difference between reform and revolution. Do I really think that even our governments can withstand the force of the Bay Streets and the Wall Streets? No, they do not. I know for a fact that senators spend about a third of their time fundraising, where big money and global capitalism runs governments and not the other way around. We need dramatic change. The earth is dying around us. To address climate change, we need governments with some strength and heft that can withstand the pressures of profit. We need that. And it's really difficult, if not impossible, to get that under the current system. So I think absolutely, we need to see dramatic change in the way that we do politics around the world, not just here. We need dramatic change. But until we get to that halcyon point, we also need to save some lives. We also
mm,
need to push our politicians into doing what they can do. And they can do way more than they do. And I
yep,
think that's a really important lesson that I learned too. That if you find a politician who's principled and you work with them, you can get a lot done. And I still feel that way. I support now individuals. I support people that I know are principled, people that I know if I work with them, that, if I can kind of be behind them and a kind of groundswell, we can get their bills moving forward. So I know now, as an activist on the outside looking in, what I learned inside looking out, that a lot can be accomplished. And we see this. We see this in the Bernie Sanders, and the AOS. Like, we see this in people, right? We see that you can actually use the word socialism, which I never thought would be ever used, by people in politics. I was told not to use it when I was just like, don't use that word. So, I mean, now you can use it. Wow. I mean, at least that's a change. We're talking about it. We've seen the Occupy movement. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We know from my generation, you can stop a war. And we did. The anti-Vietnam War movement. We've seen so many that, the Berlin Wall fell. That we thought in my day would have taken a nuclear war. I mean, honestly, we've seen all sorts of miracles happen in politics. They didn't just happen overnight. They happened because of this groundswell of people, but also with some political expression, right?
Right.
So I think it's utopian to think that our world will continue as it does. I think it's utopian. That's dreaming in Technicolor, right? The reality is, if you're going to save the planet, we're going to need dramatic change. And it's in the way we do politics and in our political systems. And that's realistic. That is the realistic alternative. But here we are, right? What do you do?
Right.
So, where it came, for example, to the American election, and there was this, push from the left, which my heart goes out to them. I understand. Oh, no, don't vote for anybody, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so sorry. No, you vote for Biden. I'm sorry. In that situation, you vote for Biden. You work in the Democratic Party to try to turn it to the left. You work with those forces within the Democratic Party that will actually make it the Democratic Party and push for reform of that party. I feel the same in my own party. There's no place else to go. That's where you go. You start there, but you don't end there, right? You don't end there. And I think that's the important reality. And then inside and outside the political sphere, you can do great things. You really can. Yep. And so I live in hope because that's realism to me.
Yep. Excellent. You just heard from Cheri DiNovo. Cheri is the author of her memoir, The Queer Evangelist, and minister of Trinity St. Paul's United Church and Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts in Toronto. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this series. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about what matters when successfully fighting for social justice issues and the importance in keeping younger generations invested in politics.
So I would say don't get old to young people. Don't do that. So that's number one. Be the young radical when you're 75, right? And also keep doing what you're doing, because for many young activists, I mean, you're the joy. I mean, you're what makes life worth living. You're the hope of the future. This is your world. Seize it. Carpe diem for sure. And it's so exciting to see the movements. Huge by comparison to the movements in my day. Like, it's so exciting, and it's so hopeful. And now the issues are so demarcated. I mean, it's so clear what we need to do, and it's so clear what we have to do, and it's so clear who's going to do it, and it's going to be that generation.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.